Tonight, the geopolitical temperature between the United States and Iran is rising again, and this time the rhetoric coming out of Washington is not cautious, not restrained, and not temporary. It is expansive, strategic, and potentially open-ended. In a series of interviews and press remarks over the past 48 hours, U.S. President Donald Trump delivered one of his most forceful messages yet about the trajectory of the confrontation with Tehran, declaring that America has the military depth, industrial capacity, and logistical endurance to sustain operations for as long as necessary, even suggesting that if circumstances demand it, the United States could fight for a very long time. While he stopped short of formally announcing a ground invasion, he notably refused to rule out the deployment of U.S. troops onto Iranian territory, stating that nothing is off the table if American interests or forces are threatened. That single phrase has triggered waves of analysis across defense circles because ambiguity in wartime signaling is rarely accidental. According to senior defense officials, approximately 50,000 U.S. personnel are currently positioned across the broader region in rotational deployments, naval strike groups, air wings, and missile defense units, a posture that suggests deterrence but also readiness. At the same time, the Pentagon has attempted to temper fears of an Iraq or Afghanistan-style prolonged occupation, with Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth insisting that this is not an endless war, even while acknowledging that further casualties are possible in high-intensity operations. That dual messaging, political resolve paired with strategic reassurance, reflects a White House walking a narrow line between projecting dominance and avoiding domestic backlash. Inside Congress, bipartisan debates are intensifying over war powers authority, with some lawmakers arguing that any sustained escalation must receive explicit legislative approval, while others contend that rapid response flexibility is essential in a volatile region. Meanwhile, administration officials have outlined shifting operational objectives: degrading Iran's ballistic missile infrastructure, limiting naval capabilities in key maritime corridors, and preventing any acceleration of nuclear weaponization pathways. Critics argue that the evolving rationale risks strategic ambiguity. Supporters counter that flexibility is necessary when facing a dynamic adversary. Behind the headlines, regional military analysts point to a layered escalation ladder: cyber operations, targeted airstrikes, maritime pressure, economic leverage, and diplomatic backchannels reportedly explored in Oman, all unfolding simultaneously. The energy markets are watching closely, as even the perception of instability around critical shipping lanes can trigger volatility. The broader question emerging tonight is not simply whether the United States can sustain a prolonged campaign, it clearly can, but whether political will, alliance cohesion, and regional deterrence will align long enough to prevent a spiral. What we are witnessing is not yet total war, not yet de-escalation, but a calibrated show of endurance. And in geopolitical crises, endurance can be as powerful as firepower. As Washington signals readiness for a long contest and Tehran recalculates its response, the world is left in a tense holding pattern, uncertain whether this moment represents the prelude to wider confrontation or the peak before a negotiated climb-down. In Part 2, we examine Iran's strategic response, the internal debates inside Washington, and the global consequences if this standoff moves from pressure to irreversible escalation.
If Part 1 was about American endurance and strategic signaling, Part 2 is about what happens when pressure meets pride, and whether deterrence holds or fractures. While Washington projects readiness for a prolonged confrontation, Tehran is engaged in its own recalibration. Iranian officials have publicly rejected what they describe as coercive posturing, warning that any expansion of U.S. operations would be met with proportional and decisive responses, yet at the same time signaling through regional intermediaries that they are not seeking uncontrolled escalation. This dual-track strategy, defiance outwardly, calculation internally, reflects a leadership that understands both the risks of direct confrontation and the leverage embedded in asymmetric capability. Analysts point to Iran's layered deterrence doctrine: ballistic missile forces capable of regional reach, naval disruption capacity in strategic waterways, cyber operations that can target infrastructure, and a network of allied non-state actors able to apply indirect pressure. None of these tools necessarily trigger full-scale war on their own, but together they create a spectrum of escalation options short of conventional invasion. That spectrum is precisely what complicates Washington's planning. Inside U.S. policy circles, debate is intensifying between hardline strategists who argue that decisive degradation of Iranian military infrastructure would restore deterrence credibility, and cautious voices who warn that miscalculation could entangle the U.S. in a broader regional cascade involving proxy engagements, energy market instability, and alliance strain. European partners are reportedly urging restraint while quietly preparing contingency energy measures. Gulf states are reinforcing defensive readiness without openly choosing sides. Global oil traders are building volatility premiums into pricing models, not because supply has collapsed, but because uncertainty itself now carries cost. Meanwhile, diplomatic channels, including reported back-channel communications through Oman, remain fragile but active, suggesting that even at peak rhetorical intensity, neither side has fully abandoned the possibility of containment. This is the paradox of the current moment. Military assets are forward-positioned, rhetoric is hardened, but escalation remains conditional. The climax progression is no longer about who strikes first, it is about who blinks last without losing face. If the United States moves toward expanded operations, Tehran could respond asymmetrically rather than symmetrically, choosing economic pressure points over battlefield confrontation. If Iran escalates too visibly, it risks consolidating international support behind Washington. Each side is aware that perception management is now as critical as kinetic capability. What makes this phase uniquely unstable is not immediate large-scale combat, it is compressed decision time. A single misinterpreted launch, cyber intrusion, or proxy incident could accelerate events faster than diplomatic channels can react. And yet, paradoxically, both governments appear to understand the catastrophic cost of total war. That mutual awareness may be the thin barrier preventing irreversible escalation. As we close this two-part analysis, the defining question is not whether the U.S. can sustain a long campaign or whether Iran can retaliate. Both capacities exist. The real question is whether strategic signaling remains controlled enough to avoid transforming pressure into permanence. For now, the standoff holds, but history shows that prolonged brinkmanship is a test not just of strength, it is a test of discipline.
By now, this confrontation is no longer defined solely by troop numbers, missile ranges, or naval deployments. It is defined by narrative dominance, internal political pressure, and the global psychology of escalation. In Washington, President Donald Trump is balancing two parallel imperatives: projecting absolute strength abroad while maintaining domestic support at home. Publicly, the message remains firm: American deterrence will not bend, and operational readiness is unquestioned. Privately, however, policy advisors understand that prolonged uncertainty carries political cost. Markets react, allies hesitate, and congressional scrutiny intensifies. The administration's challenge is no longer about proving military capability, it is about controlling the tempo of escalation without appearing to retreat. Across the region, partners are recalibrating quietly. Israel reinforces missile defenses. Gulf states diversify energy export contingencies. European governments prepare diplomatic frameworks in case emergency mediation becomes necessary. The world is not yet mobilizing for world war, but it is preparing for volatility. Inside Iran, strategic messaging has shifted toward resilience and sovereignty. Officials frame the standoff not as isolation, but as resistance against external pressure. That framing matters, because in high-stakes geopolitical crises, domestic legitimacy becomes part of national security strategy. Iranian planners understand that direct conventional confrontation with the United States would be catastrophic. Instead, the calculus appears to favor controlled asymmetry, calibrated responses that demonstrate capability without triggering overwhelming retaliation. Cyber posture, maritime maneuvering, and indirect leverage remain tools of choice. But here lies the structural risk. Asymmetry is harder to predict, harder to attribute instantly, and easier to misinterpret. A cyber disruption may be perceived as strategic escalation. A maritime incident could be read as a prelude to blockade. The escalation ladder becomes blurred. The climax progression at this stage is subtle yet dangerous. Phase 1 was rhetoric. Phase 2 was positioning. Phase 3 is perception. If one side believes deterrence credibility is weakening, it may act preemptively. If the other misreads a defensive maneuver as offensive preparation, reaction time shrinks. This is how crises accelerate, not through deliberate declarations of war, but through compressed decision cycles under pressure. Financial markets are already pricing in prolonged instability. Energy traders hedge against supply shocks. Defense analysts run simulations not of invasion, but of cascading responses. Meanwhile, diplomatic backchannels reportedly remain open, thin threads connecting capitals that publicly exchange warnings. Those threads may ultimately determine whether this episode becomes a chapter in escalation history or a case study in controlled brinkmanship. What makes this moment uniquely volatile is the convergence of military capability, political narrative, economic sensitivity, and digital-era speed. Information spreads instantly. Rumors amplify before verification. Leaders respond not only to events, but to reactions to events. The global audience is no longer passive, it shapes momentum. And so the final variable in this crisis is discipline, strategic, political, and communicative discipline. The United States has signaled endurance, Iran has signaled resistance, allies have signaled caution, none have signaled surrender. The question now is whether signaling remains contained or transforms into irreversible action. For now, the standoff persists, tense, calculated, and suspended between deterrence and escalation. History shows that such moments can either fracture suddenly or stabilize quietly. Which path this confrontation takes will depend not on who speaks loudest, but on who calculates most precisely in the hours and days ahead.
As this crisis stretches into its most delicate phase, the defining element is no longer firepower, rhetoric, or even regional positioning. It is time. Time compresses decision-making. Time magnifies miscalculation. And time tests political endurance. What began as sharp statements and strategic deployments has evolved into a sustained pressure environment where every movement, military, diplomatic, economic, carries amplified consequences. President Donald Trump continues to frame the confrontation as a matter of strength and deterrence credibility, emphasizing readiness and resolve. Yet, behind the scenes, strategic planners understand that prolonged tension without resolution increases the probability of accidental escalation. The longer forces remain forward-positioned, the more complex command structures become, the greater the chance that a localized incident spirals beyond original intent. At the same time, Tehran's posture remains calculated but firm.
Iranian leadership signals resilience publicly while navigating internal economic strain and external pressure. This creates a parallel clock inside Iran, one measuring strategic patience versus domestic tolerance. When two clocks run simultaneously in opposing capitals, crises become unpredictable, not because leaders seek war, but because they seek advantage before leverage diminishes. That is the hidden progression now unfolding, a competition not only of capability, but of endurance narratives. Washington must prove it cannot be outlasted. Tehran must prove it cannot be intimidated. Allies must prove they can remain balanced. Markets must adapt to prolonged uncertainty. And global audiences absorb every headline as if it were a turning point. The climax in such confrontations rarely arrives with a dramatic announcement. Instead, it forms quietly through incremental thresholds. A red line tested, a response calibrated slightly higher, a signal interpreted differently than intended. Military analysts describe this phase as the decision window, when leadership on both sides evaluates whether escalation yields strategic gain or strategic trap. If deterrence holds, this period will later be described as tense but controlled. If deterrence fractures, historians will point back to this moment as the final warning stage. Before we move into the closing implications of what this means for the region and the global balance of power, I want to ask you something directly. If you value in-depth, clear, and balanced geopolitical breakdowns like this, make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. It genuinely helps the algorithm push detailed analysis instead of surface-level headlines, and it allows us to continue producing comprehensive coverage on major global developments. Now, returning to the final layer of this crisis, perception stability. Neither side can afford to appear weak. Neither side benefits from total war. That paradox defines the tension. The United States projects overwhelming capacity. Iran projects unwavering resistance. The world watches not for speeches, but for shifts, small operational adjustments that indicate whether pressure is easing or tightening. In high-stakes geopolitical standoffs, survival often depends less on dominance and more on restraint. And at this exact stage, restraint is the most powerful and the most fragile weapon on the board. We now arrive at the final layer of this unfolding confrontation, the strategic endgame. After weeks of signaling, repositioning, rhetoric, and restrained maneuvering, the United States and Iran stand in a zone where every next step carries disproportionate weight. President Donald Trump has framed the posture as strength through readiness, projecting that American deterrence cannot be challenged without consequence. Tehran, meanwhile, frames its stance as sovereignty under pressure, signaling that it will not bend to external coercion. When two national narratives harden simultaneously, escalation risk does not come from intention alone, it comes from reputation management. Neither side wants war. Neither side wants humiliation, and in geopolitics, avoiding humiliation can sometimes be as powerful a motivator as avoiding conflict. At this stage, the global system itself becomes a stabilizing or destabilizing force. Energy markets react not just to supply disruptions, but to fear of supply disruptions. Regional allies calculate not only military alignment, but economic survival. International institutions prepare contingency frameworks quietly, hoping they never need to activate them. The question is no longer who strikes next, it is who steps back first without appearing to retreat, because stepping back in high-stakes diplomacy requires narrative control. It requires presenting de-escalation as victory. It requires turning restraint into strength. The progression toward climax in crises like this does not always end in explosion. Sometimes it ends in exhaustion, strategic exhaustion, economic fatigue, political recalibration. If back-channel diplomacy gains traction, this episode could transform from brinkmanship to bargaining. If a single miscalculation occurs, a misread radar signal, a proxy clash misattributed, a cyber event interpreted as state action, momentum could accelerate beyond containment. That is why analysts describe this moment as a balance of perception equilibrium, stable on the surface, volatile underneath. And before we close this full multi-part breakdown, I want to say this clearly. If you've stayed through all 5 parts, you're part of a serious audience that values depth over noise. So make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. It directly supports long-form geopolitical analysis like this and ensures these discussions continue reaching viewers who want more than headlines. As we conclude, one reality stands above the rest. Power today is not just measured in missiles, troops, or budgets. It is measured in calibration, the ability to apply pressure without triggering collapse. The United States has demonstrated endurance capacity. Iran has demonstrated resistance signaling. The international community has demonstrated cautious distance. Whether this chapter ends in negotiated stabilization or renewed escalation will depend on discipline, timing, and the ability of leaders to convert strength into strategy rather than impulse. For now, the crisis remains suspended, not resolved, not ignited, balanced on the thin line between deterrence and destiny.